Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And I'm delighted to talk again to Dr. Abdullah Ali. You are most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. It's always a pleasure, Paul.
Great to see you. You're in California. I'm in the south of France. We couldn't have been two different worlds, completely different worlds.
Right.
For those who don't remember, Dr. Ali is Professor of Islamic Law and the Prophetic Tradition at Zaytuna College in California. Now, just a kind of disclaimer here. We're going to be using certain words, certain languages, which would normally be unacceptable, highly offensive. But this is an academic discussion. We'll be discussing a book by Professor Ali based on his PhD dissertation, actually. So this is a scholarly academic context where it is, in fact, unusually appropriate or necessary to use this language, which will not normally be used at all. So please bear that in mind when I'm now going to vocalize words which I would never normally vocalize, as indeed the professor will as well, in the interest of understanding an extremely important subject, which he's written extensively about here, and he's an expert on this subject, has a PhD in the subject. So this is for people's good and the benefit of the Ummah and for people in general. So please bear that disclaimer in mind. With that in mind, here we go. So Dr. Abdullah has written this book called The Negro in Arab Muslim Consciousness. Note the word Negro there is in inverted commas. That's the book cover. And on the back cover, it says, what is the Negro? And there's a scare quotes around it. Who qualifies? What is its Arabic equivalent? And what did pre-modern writers mean by it? A very important question. There is a common belief that the Negro refers to any black person of sub-Saharan African heritage. Historians, however, often differentiate between the Moor, the Nubian, the Ethiopian, the Cushite, and the Negro. Why this distinction if all black Africans and those of African heritage presumably belong to a common pedigree, end quote. From the back cover. And this book, I mean, I'm reading as absolute goldmine, a gem full of fascinating information, completely unknown to me before. So I do highly recommend getting a copy of this book if you want a consciousness-raising experience in helping us to understand the realities of different so-called racial groups and what that really means. Anyway, so the presentation today, inshallah, will look into these very questions. And we're also going to be looking at the Prophet upon whom peace, the issue of his complexion, and why is the color of the Prophet upon whom peace such a contentious issue? And the professor has written very eloquently and fascinatingly about that in the book, which I recommend. So over to you, sir.
All right, thank you, Paul. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin, wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala sayyidina Muhammadin khairil awwalin wa akhirin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I think it probably will be good to begin with my own disclaimers from the very start. And the title itself has, of course, two particular words, two racial groups highlighted, the Negro and the Arab. And what it is not, this book is not an attack on Arabs, and I think that quite often some Arabs have assumed that this particular book is another one of those sort of tirades, anti-Arab tirades, and it's really not about that at all. It's actually an investigation into trying to understand what fundamentally one is the translational equivalent of what we call the word Negro in the English language to the Arabic language. And then two, what the Arabs meant by it when they wrote about the Negro. And I think I would add a third, which is what did even the Europeans, especially post-Enlightenment or during the Enlightenment period, actually mean when they use the word Negro? Because today there's a tendency of us to imagine or think about, we say, Black people, right, as being members of a unified race or a homogenous race, when throughout history, even Blacks themselves did not see themselves that way, right? And so to sort of give a little bit of background on this particular research, what initially sparked my interest in this particular area of study was there are a couple of things. One, when I was living on the East Coast in the United States back prior to moving to California, this was in the early 2000s, there was a young Indian brother who used to come to my house, and I used to teach him some of the books on Islam. And he had called me one time and told me and asked me a question about the Maliki school. And that particular question was, does the Maliki school have a specific opinion or position about Black women and their particular, selection of guardians in marriage? And so I asked him, like, why? Like, why would you ask us a question? I didn't recall anything like that. So he said to me, there's this brother who wants to marry. He's an Arab brother who wants to marry this African-American sister. She's in her 30s. Her father objects to the marriage. She wants to get married. And the Arab brother told her that it really didn't matter what her father said, but rather in the Maliki school, a Black woman can choose whoever she wants to be her guardian. And of course, being someone who had been studying the Maliki school for such a long time, and I had actually graduated not long before that from the university and returned to the United States, and I was a bit confused. I was, okay, well, how did I miss this? So I started to go back into my books. And then I'd come to discover that there was some particular policy that does exist, which eventually maybe we'll talk about this towards the end of the presentation, inshallah. And so this is sort of led me to dive deeper into the topic, the study of it, and then try to understand, was this a reference to all quote unquote Black people? Was it a reference to a particular type of Black person? And if it was a reference to a particular type of Black person, why? What was the reason why this particular policy existed, right? So
I also want to say, as you point out in the book, why is the Maliki school particularly have an issue with this as opposed to the other four schools? Because it seems to be particularly a Maliki problem, much to my surprise when I discovered this as well through your work, because it does seem to be the case that the Maliki, and the irony there, the Maliki is very popular in North Africa, for example, those areas, which is most attractive to so-called Black people, as you describe it in the book. So what's going on there? How can people be attracted to something that has such a racially charged and controversial teaching to it? But anyway,
and then how do the Africans themselves deal with that? What did they simply ignore those injunctions and say, okay, this is just simply some personal bias, cultural bias of those particular guys, So, or did they say, okay, well, this is not talking about us, it's talking about those people over there, right? So I was curious. I wanted to know, like, how was it possible for them to embrace this method despite the existence of this among some of the major authorities of the Maliki school, So and of course, the word Negro, as we know, it's in the Arabic language, well, in the English language, it's another way of reference to Black people in general, but in Spanish, in Portuguese, certain other languages, it just simply means Black, right? As we know. And the particular word that I believe it corresponds to in the Arabic language is the word zanji, or the zanj. And so when we look at some of the dictionaries, our English Arabic dictionaries like Hans Wehr or the Durriya of J.G. Hava, that both of them, they translate as zanji or zanj as the Negro, right? And so also we're curious. I wanted to know, okay, is this accurate that they really properly translate this word, and who is the Negro who's a reference to, right? So this is sort of where everything begun. So moving on, this particular research, I would say, is a question. It relates to the question of how old ideas still affect us today. It relates to answering the question of what is race to what is the Negro, because race, if you think about, of course, the genus category or the super category of any particular group of individuals, and then the Negro being the subspecies or species of race. And then what effects does racialization have on human behavior? These are really the main areas of concern that I had during my research. Now, this is an African-American scholar, Richard B. Moore, who lived towards the end of the start of the 20th century. I can't remember exactly when he died, but Richard B. Moore, he has a book called The Name Negro, Its Origin and Evil Use. And he was an advocate for the abandonment of the use of the word Negro, Well, this is he was a communist, and actually he was actually kicked out of the Communist Party because he was too focused on the problems of the Negro, right? Which is really interesting, right? So, but he was an activist. He actually ran for public office, among other things, and so he didn't like the fact that that during slavery that blacks were referred to as the hard N word, but then after slavery, they gave us this title Negro, and he felt that, okay, well, Negro itself, the only difference between the N word and Negro is that one was a slave and one was a free person, right? But Negro itself is not a word that is identifiable with any particular landmass. It's not identifiable with any particular group of any history of any particular group of people, et cetera, et cetera. And so he himself was pushing for adopting the hyphenated sort of title of Afro or African American, right? So he said, no, we should use Afro American or African American, and he used to write, opinion pieces for the New York Times, among other things. He was really pushing hard for this.
So Richard B. Moore was the originator of this term African American, then.
Yeah, it appears to be. It appears to be that it originates with him. Some people say that it really was Jesse Jackson who really pushed it through, but but Richard B. Moore clearly was one of the early advocates for the adoption of the term Afro-American or African American, right? So in this book, he said, because of its association with not only slavery, but with a lot of savagery, right, and connected with Black existence, he said we should not embrace it. As a matter of fact, when we look at history, you can see that there was a time in American history, in particular, that you could actually get to a fight for calling someone Black, right? But today we embrace it, so eventually Black became beautiful, Black, I'm Black and I'm proud, James Brown, I'm Black and I'm proud, so this movement started where people say, okay, you call us Black and you see Black as something negative. What they sort of turn the tables and say, okay, well, no, Black is something good. It's not bad. White is evil, right? Black is good, white is evil. Whereas before it's like, well, white is good, Black is evil. So there was this movement back in the other direction, and so eventually Blacks started to embrace Blackness, so, and the thing is interesting too is that while on one hand we take offense to having someone call us a Negro, we don't take offense to being called Black, when all that Negro means is Black, which is really interesting, right?
Isn't that originally a Latin word? I don't know the etymology of the word.
As far as I know, that originally is a Latin word, or it's definitely a word that is utilized in Spanish and Portuguese, and I believe in Italian perhaps as well. So that probably indicates its Latin origin, right? So but it has a lot of negative connotations about it, right? It related to the word itself. Now, another Black American scholar, John G. Jackson, right, who was a Egyptologist. He's also an atheist. He actually used to advocate for atheism. And you actually will find in the history of the Black civil rights movement a lot of Black activists who were either communists / atheists as well, right? So even Martin Luther King Jr. is accused of being a socialist or a communist himself, just not openly a communist, right? So, but John G. Jackson, he says the following. So he says, in the literature on Africa, Africans are commonly identified in two groups, one progressive, the other backward. The progressive peoples are called Hamites, Cushites, Moors, etc., whereas the backward ones are called Negroes. He also says the word Negro was manufactured during the Atlantic slave trade, or to put it another way, there are many species of small fish in the ocean. When put into cans, they are called sardines.
Yes.
There are no free fish called sardines. They only get that name when canned.
Very funny.
No free Africans were called Negroes. They got that name only after being enslaved. A fish becomes a sardine when imprisoned in a can, and Africans became Negroes when they were put in chains.
Amazing.
Now I'm going to return to so that first quote is really insightful. The most important part of this to me, and that, so he highlights that, okay, well, the Negro was characterized or looked upon as being the backwards version of the sort of the Black people, right? So you have Hamites, there are Cushites, there are Moors, there are the Nubians, right? There are different types of blacks, right? Even in Coptics, the Coptics were a type of blacks, right? But the Negroes, they were looked upon in a different way. Now, in the English language, and of course, traveling through perhaps Portugal, Spain, and then eventually finding its way into the English language, or just simply having its shared Latin roots, it becomes a term of beratement or of disparagement, right, in the English language, that is associated with a lot of a particular savage culture. Right? So I was concerned with, like, okay, where exactly that particular culture originates from. And so to me, my belief is that this goes back to East African primitive culture, like in the areas of Tanzania, Zanzibar, right? Because when you look at some of the early Arab geographers or lexicographers, and also their historians, when they speak about the people from that particular area of East Africa, they divide them into different groups. And the most savage or uncivilized group among them are called the Zunj, right? Which I say the Negro, right? And so they're characterized.
These guys were cannibals, weren't they? They were seen as savages, and they were naked, and they had sharp teeth. You get lots of extraordinary descriptions from ancient sources.
Right. This is the way they were being described. I mean, whether if they were that exactly was the case, I don't know. Maybe not. But this is the way that at least two of the authors who I quote in my book, they characterize, like Mas'udi's well-known historian. Mas'udi said they had sharp teeth. Like they were cannibals, and perhaps and people used to sharpen their teeth with different files in that time. Women did it, right, to expect gaps between their teeth, right? And then Arab women did those things, so it's possible, right? And then there's another famous history called The Limits of the World, Hudud al-Adam, whose author is unknown, but it's known to be a book from that same period, or close to the period when al-Mas'udi lived. Says the same thing, about the Zunj. He characterizes them as a naked, cannibalistic people, who are very like animal-like. They're very, warlike people. And he talks about that there are no Muslims in their territory, right? But when he talks about other territories which are farther up north and closer to the Mediterranean, he talks about them as being, there were Muslims there. They were, these people were half naked. The Zabish people, for instance, they were half naked. The people of Abyssinia, he talked about them very positively, how very attractive they were. They were peace-loving people, etc. Right? Because these were people, they were climatologists. They believed in the climate theory. The idea is that the Mediterranean was the center of all civilization. And the closer you got to the Mediterranean, and this is similar to Ibn Khaldun, he also believed this as well, that the closer you got to the closer you approximated the Mediterranean, the more civilized the people would become, right? And so if there are more Muslims in your territory, the more likely you're going to see some civilization, right? So that's why the Zabids, you said, well, these people are half naked, but there were some Muslims there. The Abyssinians, they have regular trade with many of the Muslim territories, right? So they had the most positive things to say about the Abyssinians. On the other hand, so this is an important point. And I think that what happens with us today is that we quite often confuse issues, and we project back into history with our own sort of current mental frameworks of what a black person is and what is meant by the Negro, and we do great injustice, right, to the people of the past, but even ourselves today, right? And so we have to be very, I guess you would say, a bit more careful about this, a bit more scrupulous about these type of things. Now, another thing I wanted to highlight is that, that there are many people who have expressed how Islam is the solution to the race problem, like that we see in the West. Everyone knows Malcolm X, and what he had to say in his autobiography and his experience in Mecca. But also, a lot of people might not know is what Mahatma Gandhi had to say about Islam, right? So Mahatma Gandhi is quoted as saying the following: "So Islam's distinctive contribution to India's national culture is its unadulterated belief in the oneness of God and a practical application of the truth of the brotherhood of man for those who are nominally within his fold. I call these two distinctive contributions. For in Hinduism, the spirit of brotherhood has become too much philosophized. Similarly, though philosophical Hinduism has no other God but God, it cannot be denied that practical Hinduism is not so emphatically uncompromising as Islam, right? So this is really interesting, really amazing stuff, right? So you say, well, Islam's distinctive contribution to India are one, it's, authentic brotherhood, and two is radical monotheism, right? To be totally honest. And so in other words, Islam, is a great power, right, for the world, right? But we add on top of that, now this particular man, I think that most people won't know who he is, but Dr. Howard Thurman, he founded the very first interracial, interdenominational church in the United States and here in San Francisco. Right? I believe it's in 1944, right? And Dr. Howard Thurman was a Unitarian Universalist Christian. He started off as a Baptist, but he became a bit more Unitarian Universalist. And he himself was highly influential on the civil rights movement, in particular, the ideas of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As a matter of fact, it was because of, or it's believed that because of the teachings of Dr. Howard Thurman with respect to nonviolence, a radical, he called it radical nonviolence, that Dr. Martin Luther King was attracted to this idea. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Howard Thurman, I believe in the 1930s, he travels to India to meet Gandhi. Mm. So when he gets there, he sits with Gandhi, and Gandhi was really baffled by the fact that these people were Christians. And so this is from one of Dr. Thurman's books, where he says Gandhi wondered why the slaves did not become Muslims. It was a sheer speculation, but in theory, it was a sound idea. For as he took pains to point out, the religion of Muhammad is the only world religion that does not practice discrimination within the faith itself. In the presence of Allah, there is neither rich or poor, wise or foolish, black or white, brown or yellow, but all are one before him. This means encompassing all diversity and all differences. So, of course, for me, I say, well, if this is the way that non-Muslims see Islam or saw Islam, then what's happened to the Muslims? Right? Why do we find Muslims today actually embracing some of the most divisive philosophies, right? Such as
very true. I just assume it's the influence of Western ideologies, actually, racial ideologies in the post-Enlightenment world. I think it's an imported virus, actually, from the West. That's my theory, anyway.
Yeah, I would agree. It's partially because of Muslims not fully understanding their religion, and of course, when you don't understand your religion, then it's easy for you to be influenced by someone else's religion, or as Sheikh Hamza says, if you don't philosophize, then others will philosophize for you. 100%. And so we get attracted to things because we find one or two elements of their philosophy, which it matches our own ethos. And then we assume that, okay, well, these people are just simply on the same page as we are, but we don't realize that people themselves actually have other agendas, that they have moral assumptions that we don't share. They have goals that we don't share, right? Right. So no, naturally, of course, Islam is a solution, right? Now, I wanted to talk a little about Dr. Jackson's work, Sherman Jackson, may Allah preserve him. So of course, our teacher, he's a very good friend. I've known him for a very long time, and I just wanted to highlight something about his particular work, Islam and the Black American. Right. So, Islam and the Black American was published in 2011. It was somewhat of we could say a hit, right? And in my viewpoint, it was because of Dr. Jackson that it became mainstream for Muslims today using the term white supremacy on a regular basis. But I think what a lot of people miss about Dr. Jackson's use of the term white supremacy is that he didn't want it to be employed in the way that Muslims are employing it today. And I try to explain to you what's meant, what I mean by that. So Dr. Jackson was concerned largely what we called sort of the invisible sort of specter of whiteness, right? In other words, the idea that Muslims have imbibed inferiority to white Western culture, right, to the extent that anything or nothing is considered good or legitimate until it is issued from someone who's white, right? So in other words, it's like what is moral is only moral because whites say it, right? Why is democracy important? Because white people consider democracy to be important. Why is freedom important? Because white people say freedom is important, et cetera. Things like that, you know. And I'm trying not to, of course, I want to bastardize his thesis, you know, but he was largely concerned. His large concern has been with Muslims themselves sort of projecting or sort of internalizing whiteness as a new type of God or type of divinity, right? You know, whereas that you can't do anything until you get the endorsement or the authorization by whites, et cetera, those type of things. You know, now on the other hand, Muslims today, when they employ the term white supremacy, most of the Muslims that I see utilizing, they're utilizing it in the same way that the critical race theorists employ white supremacy, right? Whereas it uses a term to badger white people, to others to even treat whites as irredeemable, right? While at the same time demanding from white people a certain type of, I guess you'd say, they want white people to grovel, they want them to kiss our feet, they want to apologize for things that they didn't do, etc. That's not what Dr. Jackson is interested in, you know, and he'll tell you that himself, right? You know, and the thing is actually also interesting about Dr. Jackson's use of the term white supremacy, that when his book actually was released, there were a lot of Muslims actually took offense to him actually utilizing the term and felt that, okay, this is too alienating of white people, right? No, Islam is not about racism, you know. So Dr. Jackson would respond, okay, well, you can't be racial agnostic. You can't be a racial agnostic. You know, race, it permeates Western culture, so you can't ignore it, right? On one hand, you know, but and so he said, well, my intention is not to attack white people, but is to wake you up to a realization that perhaps you may be worshiping white people, right? So, right, so that's really what his concern was, you know. And so a lot of the Muslims today who actually employ this term will use it as a weapon against white people. There were some of the same people who used to tell Dr. Jackson when he employed it that this actually was wrong and you shouldn't do it because it's too alienating, right? And so once Muslims, it seemed that they found a way to weaponize the term, they've now sort of started to utilize it. And they've actually gone beyond the original intent of Dr. Jackson. And of course, you know, he'll probably watch this video and he'll correct any mistakes that I've made about his particular thesis, but I talked to him quite a bit, you know, over the years, and so I know that he doesn't approve of the use of white supremacy in this particular form, in this particular fashion.
Yeah,
right. So when we think about white supremacy, we typically think about these sort of guys, right? And so this is one of the things he's trying to make people aware of. It's like, well, you say, well, white supremacy is not this. That's not all what's meant by white supremacy. And in that sense, Dr. Jackson himself does sort of embrace a bit of critical theory himself. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, you know, in the process of him trying to awaken Muslims, right, to the specter of, we call sort of white supremacy, right, or white domination, right?
And I think also this idea that the Hollywood Nazi is also a thing, because, I mean, as if, you know, they are kind of evil and they look kind of sinister. They got fangs and they're just horrible people. Let alone anything. And you see in the top right there, that's from a very well-known American film.
Movie, right?
Yeah, very quite shocking actually. But then actual National Socialists, you know, are different creatures. But there is an element of stereotyping and kind of dramatizing in a kind of unreal way in Hollywood, at least. But of course, you're not talking about white supremacy in that sense. It's a much more pervasive, hegemonic reality, which is almost invisible, really, to many of us, because it's just the atmosphere we breathe, rather than these kind of crude caricatures, which kind of make it safe for us. Because hey, actual Nazis are these kind of weirdos you see on movies. So nothing to do with us. We can just carry on, business as usual.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. You know. So these particular guys, they're sort of they're easy bait, right? You know, for people. You know, say, okay, well, yeah. Oh, there's no structural problem, right? You know, where there's white domination in any particular part of the world. You have and so they point to these sort of guys, and these guys sort of get the brunt of people's attacks, right? You know, but personally, like I've told people before, I've never in my entire life met a KKK member. I've never encountered a skinhead, right? You know, I may have seen them on TV, right? You know, so and I know that people like this exist, you know, but they're not something that is a major concern that I have in my own particular life, right? So at any rate, so the point being that, okay, that Muslims have the solution to the race problem. We have the solution to the race problem, but it seems we are adding to the problem, right? There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says that Shaitan, Iblis, قد أيس إن إبليس قد أيس أن يعبده المصلون في جزيرة العرب. That Iblis, he has given them all hope that he will be served by those who pray in the Arabian Peninsula. ولكن في التحريش بينكم. However, he is fine for you to serve him with respect to creating division between the most of you. In other words, that if he knows that Muslims are not going to openly worship him, but he'll try to undermine the believers in other ways, right? So creating division, sowing discord between all of us, and not only the Muslims but humanity overall, right? So this particular book, Critical Race Theory, which that was written by two authors, you know, I'll talk about the authors in a minute. You know, it sort of summarizes what critical race theory is all about. And I do think that there's certain aspects of critical race theory which we have to be very, very circumspect about, right? Circumspect about, you know. And so, so the authors are a man by the name of Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, perhaps not properly pronouncing that person's name, you know, but this particular book, it gives, I believe, gives a good overview or summary of what critical race theory is. Now, I've written an article called "How Islamic is Critical Race Theory," and when I posted that some years ago, of course, a lot of the Black Muslim critical race theorists, they were upset, you know, and they started to attack me, and they would say things like, "Well, how can he talk about critical race theory only relying upon a single book? You know, you need to have, he's not a critical race theorist, he's not a critical race scholar." And I say, okay, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm not, right? You know, but I also don't think that I need to read all the important books in critical race theory to understand what the foundational teachings of critical race theory are, you know. And I like to say to those people who actually challenge this to say, okay, tell me what I say is wrong, right? You know, if I've actually said something that is misrepresenting what critical race theory is, then I would think that's a legitimate critique, right? But at any rate, you know, here are some of these. They say that these are the 6 foundational moral assumptions of critical race theory. So first is that racism against colored people is endemic to Eurocentric societies. And so by colored people, they're not just talking about Black people. They're talking about anyone who's not white. So now the word colored means anyone who's not white, even though 1924, when we had the Racial Integrity Act in America, where it was, you know, intermarriage between whites and non-whites was outlawed, right, in 1924, that those who are colored in that particular law were a reference to Blacks and Native Americans, or any person who has an admixture of all 3 or 2, at least 2 of those particular races, right? Those were considered the colored people. But now this new sort of movement has arisen related to critical race theory, where it's a binary between whites and non-whites, right? So again, coming back to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, is that Shaitan he's okay with you serving him with respect to sowing discord between people, right? How can you sort of judge a person by the content of their color, right? As opposed to by their color, as opposed to the content of their character, right? So that's what Islam is supposed to be about, you know. But it's like automatically, if you're a white person, then you are, you know, that you are a racist, and you're irredeemably racist. In other words, you can't help but to be racist if you're white. This is what it teaches, right? So but racism is endemic to your Eurocentric societies. In other words, all your Eurocentric societies are endemically racist. Secondly, white over colored ascendancy serves important purposes, psychic and material. And again, there's truth in some of these things that they say, right? So in other words, like when people talk about white privilege, I'm often like really frustrated quite often because I feel that the whites who say that they don't have white privilege, they don't understand, or rather, well, put it like this, word it a different way. When people say that a white person has white privilege, they mean it in a lot of different ways. They mean that they have sort of a psychological privilege, you have economic privilege, that you have political privilege, etc. Right? And in some particular, in some context, that is the truth. With a lot of white people, that is the case, right? But there are a lot of whites, like for instance, many times the Irish. If you tell the Irish person, okay, well, you have white privilege, most of the time they say, what are you talking about? I don't have any white privilege. I have to fight just like everybody else, right? Because in America, for instance, the Irish were persecuted at one time. The Italians were persecuted at one time as well. The Jews were persecuted, and even in America during the 20th century, even. But privilege, to me, I believe there is white privilege, but it's much more of what we can call a social privilege, which pertains to a psychological state of inferiority that non-whites have. Right? In other words, I'll give you an example of this. I moved to the Bay Area back in 2007, and there were certain messages I was doing the Jummah khutbah at for a very long time. And they would typically post the videos of the khutbah of certain people, not everybody, but certain people. They would post their khutbahs. Now I had been doing khutbah for multiple years, and not even one of my khutbahs had been posted up to that point.
Amazing.
And so there was one white brother who had a new convert to Islam, he moved to the Bay Area, who actually was a student of mine. And so eventually he was invited to the same masajid to do khutbah, and right after he gave khutbah, they posted his videos.
Yeah.
Right?
Amazing.
And so of course I raised an issue with it. I was like, well, why is it that you're posting his videos and not mine, right? So I'm thinking, what was it about him that made his khutbah so special, right? Yeah. And only reason I can think of was that, okay, well, there was an inferiority complex, or rather they placed more value on whiteness than on blackness, or something along those lines, right? So a lot of white people don't realize, okay, well, that is the sort of way that a lot of non-whites, they interact with them. A lot of blacks, for instance, if you interact with a white person, say for instance, you go into a store, a lot of black folks, and I catch myself doing this as well from time to time, even still today, is that if I see a white person working in the store and I need something, I'll actually start to speak more formally. And I'll say, excuse me, sir.
Oh, really?
But if it's a black person, I'll say, hey, excuse me, where I have there's a different sort of way that I approach the individual. But again, that's something within me, right? And I would say I've been conditioned that way, right? And I think a lot of white people don't understand that, that this is this is part of the privilege. To me, I think this is the most harmful aspect of what we call white privilege that does exist. But I do think it's completely legitimate when an Irishman says, what do you mean I don't have privilege? I'm poor, just like you, right? I say, no, true.
I think, for a long time, I didn't buy into this white privilege idea. I thought it was just a load of left-wing rubbish, to be honest, until I started to travel a lot, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years with blogging theology work. And I've been traveling, obviously, but by air mostly, with people, with friends, colleagues, who are not white, and to see the difference in the way people are treated, and to hear the stories from colleagues and friends who say Arab background and so on, was absolutely extraordinary. And I heard the stories so often from different people who I know and trust and rely on, academics, some of them. And I could see for myself how people are differently treated at passport control, immigration, and so on. and it's consistent and almost universal, and a genuinely eye-opener for me. Before, I'd never noticed. Well, I hadn't been traveling like that before. So now I know it's real from my experience, and I expect it to be the case. I mean, you went to mention the Bay Area. When I went to the States last year to Zaytuna, as you know, the long queue at San Francisco airport, waiting to go through passport control. And the guy in front of me, I knew what the questions were going to be. 3 questions, like purpose of visit, how long you're going to be here, whatever. And so I knew I could answer those questions in about 20 seconds. And I saw the people who took a long time and the people who went through like lightning. And it took me probably about 10 seconds to go through passport control. Whoosh, it was like, and that's not what happened to other people. You could see what was going on, the way people were treated differently. And I expected it, and it's what I saw, and it was really an eye-opener, and that's typical, unfortunately. So white privilege certainly exists, and a lot of white people don't know this, they don't see it, they don't believe it, but it's real. And this is without any kind of theory or looking at any kind of academic studies. It's purely anecdotal from my experience, but I've certainly seen it, and I hear it from friends and colleagues. They tell me these extraordinary stories, and they're all the same over and over and over. White privilege exists. And it's not just white people that do it. You find in many some certain Muslim countries, very famous Muslim countries, that actively do it as well. And so this kind of racism is internalized and perpetuated.
Yes, right. I was
racist, but they are. I mean, so they treat whites differently from Arabs and so on. Even Arabs do it themselves. And this was like, you've got to be kidding, but they do it, and I've seen it.
Right. Yeah, I remember I interviewed for a job in the Gulf area some years ago. Before I came to Zaytuna, I was applying for a job over there, and the guy who interviewed me, he's a Muslim guy, and he told me point blank. He said, "Listen, you're unlikely to get this job because of your name."
Wow.
He said that I've actually noticed. He said, "I've noticed that they prefer people with European names."
Wow.
Right, to actually come, work here, so you do have a big problem, but again, there's not a whole lot that white people can do about that. Right? You understand, right? that this is something that has to change within us. And again, this is part of like Dr. Jackson's project too, right? I would say is that, you have to, something within you has to change where you treat everyone the same based upon their character, not based upon their color. Right. So, again, just me, at least my understanding of Dr. Jackson's project, right? But again, thirdly, races are social constructs, not biological facts, right? So this is, again, at least a claim that critical race theorists make. Number 4, differential racialization. In other words, or as stated here, the calculated alteration of discriminatory policies between one racial minority to another, depending upon time and circumstance, happens in response to shifting needs in the labor market, right? So in other words, economic problem, we having all these Mexicans come in. Oh man, that's a threat, right? We have to demonize the Mexicans, right? Or it can be the same thing when it was the Italians, or the same thing when it was the Irish, the same, So in other words, there's some truth to these patterns, right? Then we have what is called intersectionality and anti-essentialism, right? So a person is more than just a single characteristic, right? You're not only your race, you can be characterized on the basis of your sexual orientation, your political affiliation, etc. So all those sort of different, there can be different layers to your oppression. You can be a woman plus a lesbian plus a black person, right? Right. So you're oppressed as a woman, also as a black woman, and also as a lesbian woman, so you get default oppressed status. And then you can be a Muslim as well, Muslim woman as well, right? Being a woman by yourself is one thing, but you can be a black woman plus a black Muslim woman. Now you have the double whammy, right? Or triple whammy there, which is that, you're oppressed as a woman, you're oppressed as a Muslim, and you're also oppressed as a black person, right? So intersectionality is what's meant by that. But then also what they call anti-essentialism, which is fundamentally the idea that one should not judge all the individuals or the members of a race or assume that each of them all are uniform or the same. right?
But didn't that contradict what you said earlier on when you were characterizing CRT as essentialist when it comes to white people? So white people are irredeemable.
Yes.
They can't help themselves. So, but it's okay to have this anti-essentialism attitude towards one group, but not towards white groups. It doesn't seem to be
Right. So white people are all the same, but no one else is. Right.
Exactly.
So only white people are all the same. Right. But they don't say that. We don't say that expressly, So this is so in my particular article where I actually challenge these ideas, that's one of the things I pointed out. And so some people would say, oh, he doesn't understand critical race theory. I said, well, if I don't, then okay, help me understand, because that's what it looks like to me, that basically you're saying that the only group of people who can be racist are white people, right? And they actually do say that because they said that you have to have power in order for you to be racist, right? So I can actually call you all types of names. I can call you racial slurs, but it's not racist because I'm not white, right? I can call you. I can say I'm not going to say those things, but I in the article I gave some examples of what I was talking about. Is that I can say all these things about a white person, but I can't be racist. Why? Because I'm not white, and by virtue of not being white, I have no power. Because the only way you can be racist is if you have power.
But non-whites can have power, as I mentioned already. Say at passport control, at immigration over other non-whites and treat them in a racially negative way. I've seen it. So non-whites do have power over each other, so to speak, in these contexts.
No, but it's not real power. It's not real power, but white people have all the real power. You have borrowed power. That power has been borrowed. Your power is vicarious, right? It's given to you by white people, right? Yeah. And then finally, the unique voice of color thesis, which posits that every group, due to their experience with the white supremacist order, has developed a unique standpoint for explaining one's socio-political and economic status. That standpoint is considered superior to that of whites, who are presumed to generally lack the capacity to see the privilege with which they live. So, in other words, again, this is my unique voice standpoint theory. You can find this in feminism too. Standpoint theory. The oppressed have a broader lens to understand the relationship between him or herself and the oppressor than the oppressor actually does. So. Again, there may be some value in some of these things, but it's deconstructive, but it's not good at reconstruction, right? Right. Which brings us to, again, so that issue, like I said, I wanted to highlight that because I think that this is one of the things that complicates Muslims' mandate to actually heal the world, help the world to heal, right? That there's people have expressed that Islam actually has the power to solve the race problem. But again, come back, what is race? Is it a biological fact or is it a social construct? We say, okay, race is a combination. It's not simply a social construct because clearly some people share the same color, same hair texture. They share the same DNA, right? From mother and father, from, tribe, whatever, things like that, right? It all depends on how you define a race, right? But it's not completely biological, right? To the extent that one would assume that because of one's biology, that certain behavioral characteristics would result from your color. Now, of course, we have the monogenetic theory, which is more predominant theory. We all believe that we come from Adam and Hawa, alayhim assalam, Adam and Eve. And this is something that even in the scientific realm appears to be predominant, that human beings go back to a single progenitor or go back to a single-celled organism. And then sort of that organism is, talk about evolutionary theory, and sort of it expands and multiplies. And then eventually we all became what we are today. And then there are all others like Voltaire and similar people who believes in the polygenetic theory, that human beings do not originate from a single progenitor. But most people, as Muslims, we have to believe in the first one. We believe that Adam is the father of humanity and Hawa is the mother of humanity, and that all of us originated from them. And of course, there were mutations that happened over the centuries, millennia, and we are what we are today. And it is part of the test that we all live with today.
But by the way, the Quran does say that these different groups are actually willed by God and a blessing from God. They're actually not some kind of just freak of nature. I mean, that these are actually willed by our Creator.
Yeah, exactly. Right? You know, that you know that we made you from a male and from a female, and we made place you, excuse me, into to peoples and into tribes in order for you to come to know one another. But in akramakum indallah itqakum, and the most honorable, noble among you are the one who is most conscientious of God, right? Most conscious of God among you, right? So yeah, so that is the Quranic teaching, right? That we believe that we originate from a single progenitor, even if, of course, some people today have attempted to try to question or to disturb that understanding, which had been spread as the orthodox understanding and belief from the early centuries of Islam, right? So this one scholar, Matthew Fry Jacobson, he said of race that it is both a conception and a perception. Now, the perception to me is a more important aspect here, in that although we've moved beyond what we call sort of blatant institutional racism in Western societies, we still live with the perceptions that were injected into our minds, which go back centuries. Right? So in other words, I personally believe that as long as Westerners don't return or sort of rehash these little arguments and refute them, then race itself is going to be a source of is going to be an Achilles heel for the West, right? And I believe that this is the fundamental reason why we still are living in such a period of crisis, because it looked like after the election of Barack Obama as president, that people were saying, okay, now America is post-racial. Yeah. Now anything's possible. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump becomes president, and then now America becomes the most racist place on the planet again. You know, is that racism has never gone away, right? So, and it's really interesting that how that sort of change, that sort of shift is so quickly happened. You know, I grew up, you grew up, you know, we saw like multiple shows on television that actually were dealing with the race problem. Like, you know, I don't know, you probably remember All in the Family. There's Archie Bunker. There was the Jeffersons. There were, I mean, I don't know if you watch these programs, you know, but there were these, a lot of
the American shows. So
yeah,
but
yeah, but a lot of the American shows, right? Yeah, a lot of the American shows were actually normalizing race relations, right? But in a very funny way, while they actually have racist characters in those shows. And so people were becoming accustomed to actually interacting with the opposite race, and even, you know, making fun of it, right? So, but then all of a sudden things change. So now we find these very fragile people, unfortunately now, you know, where, you know, like a lot of the negative ideas that existed about blacks and the more positive things about whites, we still live with those things, right? So, and I'll show you what I mean by this as we move forward, inshallah. You know, so another scholar, Audrey Smedley, she talks about race as a construct, and she said it was something that was intricately linked with certain presuppositions of thought held by European colonists from the 16th to the 18th centuries. During that period, the word was transformed in the English language from a mere classificatory term of biophysical variation into a folk idea. This idea expressed certain attitudes toward human differences, as well as prejudgments about the nature and social value of these differences. Right. So the word itself has gone through an evolution. And so what's meant by it, it was used just as a basic classificatory term, right? But then all of a sudden people started to associate certain types of behaviors and motivations to races. But then how many races are there? You know, if you ask the average person today, well, how many races are there? You know, I said, name them. You know, say there's white, there's black, there's yellow, there's red, there's brown. Right? Where does that come from? You know, it comes from a man known as Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. He's a German, and I have a slide on him coming up. But here I just want to highlight this. So this is a quote from Darwin, where he's showing that, so all these scholars, these anthropologists who attempted to classify the human races, you know, they differed about, well, how many races existed? Yeah, is it 2? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 5, 6, 7, 8? Is it 16? Is it 63? Right? So many different ideas, you know, but we live with the idea that there are about 5 different races on the planet. right? So this is Matthew Fry Jacobson once again, where he says the period from the 1920s to the 1960s saw a dramatic decline in the perceived differences among those white others. In other words, so what he's talking about here are like the Jews, the Italians, the Irish, among others as well, like in the Americas, right? So these at one point in the United States were not considered to be white people. They weren't classified as white. The Jews weren't considered to be white, and this is something that even lasted up until the start of the 20th century, right? So then he goes on and says, okay, well, immigration restriction along with internal black migrations altered the nation's racial alchemy and redrew the dominant racial configuration along the strict binary line of white and black, creating Caucasians where before had been so many Celts, Hebrews, Teutons, Mediterraneans, and Slavs. And also, so people that would actually, what's your race? And they would write down, oh, Slav, right? What's your race? Teuton. What's your race? Or Mediterranean. But then all of a sudden, between the 1920s and 1960s, all these people became white. They became white legislatively, and then in the public perception as well. They became legitimately white, right? So even whiteness is a social construct, right? Largely, which erases people's individual identity as well. Now, to me, there are actually the four most influential people, and inshallah, and we're coming close to the end of this presentation, inshallah. But they're the four most influential voices on contemporary conceptions of race, or perceptions of race, rather. I probably should update that. But perceptions of race are four men, and you can say conceptions too. One is this man, a Swedish botanist by the name or known as Carl Linnaeus. And we're going to talk about him in a minute. And also Blumenbach, who was a German. And then Arthur de Gobineau, the Frenchman, the French aristocrat, who actually is the one who created the Aryan master race theory, right? Yeah. And then we have Charles Darwin, right? So Charles Darwin, he introduced or gives us the idea of evolution, or the idea that a race can degenerate from a superior class down to an inferior class, and I believe that these are the four most important thinkers with respect to race. So Carl Linnaeus, for instance, Carl Linnaeus, he began with a reflection on the four humors, right? Blood, phlegm, choleric, and melancholy, or black bile, yellow bile, and the association of each particular type of fluid in the body with a certain type of temperament, right? So if you have a sanguine person, has a balance with respect to their blood. A person has too much phlegm becomes sluggish. The person who has too much yellow bile is prone to anger. The one who has black bile is too much, it becomes sad. But he went a little bit further than this when he classified the races into four categories: black, white, red, and yellow. Right. So the red, like the Native American or the Native Australian, is said to be an individual who's a choleric. So we grew up seeing like this imagery of the Native Americans, like when you find the Europeans, they enter into American soil, they're conquering, and then the Native American savages, they're coming on their horses, and they're and they just want to scalp someone, right? They're just angry people, right? So they are portrayed that way. I remember growing up seeing TV shows that portraying the Native Americans that way, right? So the Native Americans, or the natives in general, right? Was sometimes they called Amerindians, that they are, that they're choleric people. They're ruled by habit. In other words, it's almost like as if they just almost can't help themselves. They just rule by habit, right? The Europeans, on the other hand, are sanguine people. These are the people that have a nice balance of blood. They're ruled by custom. See, custom requires a little bit more rationality. The custom develops. There's a justification for why we do things, right? So you're ruled by custom as opposed to habit. So I think of like habit would be like if I just have a habit of just hitting myself in the head with my microphone, over and over and over. It's just, I don't know. It just, but I'm a choleric. I'm unsettled. I'm angry, the sanguine person is happy, is balanced. And then you have the Asian or the yellow person, right? The Far Easterner is ruled by belief. So belief is a step down from custom, right? Because belief is like superstition, right? These people are superstitious people. And then you have the Black African who's phlegmatic, and the phlegmatic, relax. It was another way of saying lazy, right? So the African is ruled by caprice. And also this is actually even worse than habit, because ruled by caprice means like you've been ruled by your appetite. Other words, it was like an animal sees another animal and is interested in intercourse. It just pounces, jumps on the animal, right? Or a lion sees a deer, a lion goes after the deer, just has to have it. You can't control yourself, right? So even though some people defend Linnaeus and they say, well, this is all very innocent, he was just basically looking for a simple way to classify people. But when you add these motivations and temperaments and that in itself, becomes a big problem, right? So we still live with the ideas about all the positive things about white people, all the negative things about Black people, the negative things about other people as well, right? And I say that Carl Linnaeus is extremely important for this particular perception that we still have. The second man who actually was a mentee of Linnaeus was Blumenbach, who is from Germany. Now his main contribution was the introduction of what we call the brown race or the Malay race to the list of those classifications. And he was the one who first started to use the term Caucasian to refer to white people. And originally he was talking about the people from Georgia, the country of Georgia. And he actually felt that they were the original people. They were the origins of humanity. They're the most beautiful, etc., things like that. So when people say, well, how many races they are, they'll say, well, it's white, black, red, yellow, and brown. Okay, this is Blumenbach. This is where this idea comes from. But we always
he was arguing the original race was white. Interestingly,
yeah, exactly right. He said the original people were white. Right, they were the people from, and in particular, the people of Georgia. That's where the origins of humanity they can be traced. And then we have this man, the Frenchman, Arthur de Gobineau, who actually said Adam is the ancestor of the white race. Right? But then he goes further and says, all civilizations derive from the white race, that none of can exist without its help. And that a society is great and brilliant only so far as it preserves the blood of the noble group that created it, provided that this group itself belongs to the most illustrious branch of our species. And so he goes on, he divides white people into three fundamental classifications. You have the Nordic, the Alpine, and the Mediterranean. And so some argue that this is how the Arabs were, placed into the category of whiteness. They would be made white because of Gobineau. Gobineau's classification of white. So the Mediterranean whites, which they say these are the Arabs. So the Arabs themselves by default became white as well. And then in the collective imagination, when we think of an Arab person, we automatically think that the Arabs are white, when in fact, as my book tries to highlight, is that the original Arabs, that they, as described by Muslim historians, were brown and black. Those are the majority of their colors. Right? So this is something that Gobineau says about the Negro. So he said the Negroid variety is the lowest and stands at the foot of the ladder. The animal character that appears in the shape of the pelvis is stamped on the Negro from birth and foreshadows his destiny. Right? So again, it's just like, well, the Negro just a step down from a gorilla. It's a step down from, any other animal, has big testes, right? So promoting the stereotype that is, and actually that stereotype goes back centuries. It doesn't start with Gobineau. Actually, you can find it even in the teachings, refutations of Al-Jahiz, when he's actually responding to certain attacks on the East African by certain Arab writers. That he actually embraces it and said, yes, we do. We do have large, whatever, right? So then he goes and says his intellect will always move within a very narrow circle. He is not, however, a mere brute, not a gorilla. For behind his low receding brow, in the middle of his skull, we can see signs of a powerful energy, however crude as objects. If his mental faculties are dull or even non-existent, he often has an intensity of desire. So again, remember Linnaeus, the rule by caprice, right? So there's an intensity of desire and so of will, which may be called terrible. Many of his senses, especially taste and smell, are developed to an extent unknown to the other races. Right? So we're just like animals, right? The very strength of his sensations is the most striking proof of his inferiority. Now, of course, the reason I even bring him up is that, again, we're talking about people who are very influential. These are influential people, right? Their books are being read by the aristocrats, the people who run
this French aristocrat. Have you ever met a black person in his life, really? I mean, goodness knows if he even met anyone outside of his social circle. It's rather extraordinary.
Right. But even Darwin he didn't escape from this as well. Even Darwin, we know Darwin for his Origin of Species, but he has another book called Descent of Man. Right.
But sorry, the full title of the Origin of Species. Do you remember what it is? It's very interesting.
Origin of Species. Yeah. Oh boy.
It makes reference to. I'll look it up. Sorry, but it is relevant. It's only ever quoted as the Origin of Species, but that's not the full title. And the full title is interesting. Sorry to interrupt. I'll look it up and get back to you.
Yeah. No, it's not coming to me now, but I do remember there is something additional to that because I have a copy of it and I've read it years ago. But he has another book, Descent of Man. Yes. And he says at some future period, not very distant, as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. So you're talking about evolution, right? Mm-hmm. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between a man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Right. So in other words, it's to say that in the future, as we evolve, the difference between the human being and the closest intervening animal, right, to us will be further than it is between, again, to say the Negro or the Australian and the gorilla. Yeah. So this is Darwin. And so for them, in their minds, they didn't see this as racist. They thought they were doing science. This was sort of pseudoscience. And so I say that until the West actually takes account of this sort of history and the ideas that actually influence the way that we see one another still today, then race itself is going to continue to be an Achilles heel that anyone can take advantage of to undermine the stability in Western countries, right? So I believe that this is a fundamental problem, right? That they have to contend with. Sorry to interrupt.
Before you go on, I found the title of Origin of the correct full title, and you can Google this. I'm looking at Wikipedia. The full title of Charles Darwin's most famous book is the following. It's not what you normally hear. There's a reason for this, I'm sure. On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection. Or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. That's the full title. So we stop at the Origin of Species, but the bit "or" is part of the title, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle of life. And you kind of get this idea, obviously, with people like Hitler later, this kind of social Darwinian idea as well. It's all about struggle, Mein Kampf, my struggle, the struggle of races as well. And, he would have been aware of Darwin, and life is all about the preservation of favored races over against others. So it's there in Darwin very explicitly. But it's interesting, he's always ignored the full title. And if you put it in, then I think Darwin would have been cancelled quite quickly. But
right, exactly, right. Yeah, and even Arthur Gobineau, his book is called "The Inequality of Human Races."
Oh, really?
Yeah, the inequality of the human races, and it's very blatant, and it's right in your face, and so it's there. In other words, there's reason for people to be outraged about the history, right? And there's some people who are usually in the conservative camp who think that, okay, the best thing that we can do about racism is just to stop talking about it. Right. But no, that's not going to make it go away, right? If anything, we need to talk about it, but we have to talk about it in a more constructive fashion than the way that the critical race theorists want us to.
That's where Islam comes course.
Exactly.
There's positive message rather than just simply a critical one and putting people against people. Here we have a solution, a healing for humanity.
Right, exactly. Whereas critical race theory actually increases racism.
Exactly.
It makes white people who typically would not have been racist actually become more racist in their thinking, right? Because it's like when you start to tell me that I'm just nothing, I'm just irredeemable, I can't help but to be racist. I'm guilty of implicit unconscious bias on a regular basis. That's really not much I can do about my condition. Then I mean, why either I'm going to just fold and just comply and grovel at your feet, or I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to say, you know what? No, I'm proud to be white, right? Western civilization is better than any other civilization, and then it's all the other things happen, right? So, and we don't want that occurring. But what we do see that happen, this has happened, but we have to take a much more, prophetic approach, and I think that this is the way to do so, but it has to be a conversation. We have to bring out, okay, why are people angry, right? Did white people do anything wrong? Yes. This is an example. This is what they said. This is the ideas, and even Darwin's ideas. You start talking about eugenics and the Planned Parenthood and all those people who wanted to kill people felt that they didn't deserve to live because they were useless eaters. So all of those things have to be rehashed and spoken about, and we have to work through them. And this is just simply a list of some of the other things I've written that if people are interested in looking deeper into what I have to say, because there's not going to be enough time to cover everything with respect to the book today. But of course, the book we're discussing, and I wanted to give that introduction to sort of give some context on what I'm trying to, I guess you'd say, address, right? Some of the things I'm trying to address, even though I may not directly address them in the book, but this is, I'm trying to talk about things within our tradition, but even also outside our tradition, to show that there is hope, that there is something that can be done to remedy a lot of these issues, right? So I have the article Bilal and Other Oppressed Minorities in the Early Islam, Beyond Racism, which is found on the Renovatio website. And then also How Islamic is Critical Race Theory for anyone who's interested and looking further into some of my writings.
How Islamic is Critical Race Theory. Yeah, I'm certainly reading that as well. Before we finish that, I just want to mention this, the book in question, of course, The Negro in Arab Muslim Consciousness. Certainly fascinating, really hugely illuminating for me. But we can't conclude. Sorry, but I have to go back to this question, which I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah. And that is just the one issue, the prophet's complexion. And this is something discussed on page 52 of the book. And this is an issue that has been weaponized even by some Christian missionaries, I've noticed. What's the problem with the prophet upon whom be peace is complexion? Why is the color of the prophet such a contentious issue?
Well, I think that the main reason is a contentious issue is because of the way that we understand the terms white and black, right, in the English language, right, in particular. And it may be in other languages too, like maybe French or German, it may be the same problem, right? And so when we say white, I think of someone who looks like you, right? And when I say black, I may or may not think about someone who looks like me. And I just think that it's very clear that the Arabs did not classify themselves as either white or black. That's the first thing, right? Yeah. They didn't see themselves that way. If anything, the pre-modern races, they were defined largely by language and shared history. Right. Language and shared history were the two, I would say, the key components of that. And color was secondary. Color was something, it was much more of a coincidental issue. So the Arabs would notice, oh yeah, well, most of us are this color, that color. The prophet himself clearly, at least in my opinion, in my readings over the years, the prophet was of a fairer or a brighter color of the Arabs. He was
wheat color. Use the word the similarity of the wheat
right.
color. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So most of the hadiths, or rather the strongest hadiths, with respect to the color of the prophet, uses a term which is somewhat unclear, called azhar alone. So the prophet ﷺ was azhar alone, which I translate as bright faced, right? there's a narration where he's described as being asmar, which is brown, or rather light brown. There is a narration who says that he was the color of what's called a jumara, which is the pith of a date tree, sort of the inside color of a date tree. And then there's also a hadith in Bukhari where one of the narrators describes the prophet as being abyad, which is what we typically translate is white. Now, the problem with taking this at face value is, of course, I said when we say white, a person automatically would think, okay, we're talking about European white, but that's not what was meant by it.
Yep.
Or as Muhammad Dhahabi, who is a great Shafi'i hadith scholar, he said that anytime the Arabs called someone white and they meant their color, it meant hinti alone. So my eyes are tearing for some reason, but it is hinti alone, which meant weak colored, right? So the prophet was weak colored according to Imam al-Dhahabi, right?
And I actually had to Google that. I mean, of course, I know what color wheat is, but to Google it, just see some pictures of wheat, just to remind me. So, that's the hue that we're talking about.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So either color wheat, or we're looking at the color of the pith of a tree, right? The inside of the tree, the tree stump, right? Usually the brighter color. Sometimes you can find a darker color in the middle circle, but outside the circle is a bit lighter. That's what abyad means according to Imam al-Dhahabi. And according to most of your lexicographers, well, not most of them, all of the Arabic lexicographers, they would say that typically when the Arabs said someone was white, they didn't mean that they were white in color, that they meant that the person had good character. The person was a good moral person, right? Yeah. So when they called them white, but anytime they use white to actually refer to a person's skin color, it was typically used as a type of disparaging comment that they were making, right? Wow. Because abyad, it meant that a person had vitiligo, was in Arabic is called al-baras, which they describe as sort of the loss of pigmentation, in spots, like so people had melanin, so the loss of melanin, over time. That's what it's called, baras. So for Arabs, they consider that to be some type of ailment. It's considered an ailment, an offensive ailment. As a matter of fact, it can become a basis for divorce, right? If it's discovered, so you'll find this in the Maliki school, especially. They'll mention that, okay, if you marry a woman or if a woman marries a man and it's discovered that the person had baras, right, then, or vitiligo, then that can become grounds for divorce, right? Wow. Because it's almost like equated with leprosy. They sort of treated it that way. Leprosy, vitiligo.
So I didn't notice that before when I bought the goods, so I acquired them. Damaged goods.
Right. So it's almost like damaged goods. It's like damaged goods. So to refer to someone as white meant that you had vitiligo, right? And that in itself was something disparaging. And it was so disparaging that even when Arabs referred to people who actually they considered to be white, they didn't call them white. Like, for instance, the people who were white according to the Arabs were the Persians, the Syrians, the Europeans, in particular, largely those. Sometimes you find mentioned the Turks are added as well sometimes. But they called them red people. They called them the red people, al-hamra, right?
Why do they call them that? I mean, I'm looking at logical reasons which may not have anything to do with logic, but why red?
Because they didn't want people to mistake them to think that they're saying that they have vitiligo. They say, no, these are not people who have vitiligo. These actually are people who are red. In other words, some say it's because of when white people they get angry. You can see the color of the blood, underneath your skin. You get red in the face.
Bright red, quite often.
Right, yeah. So,
I see. That's a point.
Right. So they call them the red people. So these are the people that Arabs consider to be white, and so they classified them as white, not themselves. But they also didn't classify themselves as black, because the black people for most of the Arabs were the Africans, right? Right. So when you say that the prophet was white, it sounds as if you're saying the prophet was European, or the prophet was Persian, or the prophet was from Damascus, right? For instance, but we clearly know that wasn't the case. So that's a problem. And if you say he's black, implies that the Prophet is African. And we also know that's not true unless you take a leap of faith and you go into Hajar, the wife of or the concubine of Ibrahim alayhis salam, that she was from Egypt, and so therefore the Arabs are African, right? Because Egypt's in Africa, right? But again, defining what Africa is and what is not, and so that in itself can become very arbitrary too, because at one time, as we all know, Africa was not a name for the entire continent. Afriqiya was, of course, the name that the Roman Empire gave to the northern sector of the African continent, right, which included places like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, those type of places, right? So that was Afriqiya. So, right, so that's fundamentally why is a problem to say, well, okay, the Prophet is white. Then, okay, well, you're suggesting that he's European, but he's not European. If you say he's black, you're suggesting that he's African. So we shouldn't say either, right? If anything, so the Prophet ﷺ, he was wheat colored. If Imam al-Dhahabi is correct about that, that this is what it meant. But clearly, there are those different narrations that say that he was asmar, or say that he was a jamara, like the pith of a palm tree. And that, of course, darker than me. I would say, to me, I would think that, based upon my understanding of the language, that the Prophet ﷺ probably, his complexion probably was more so like that of Habib Ali Jifri than anyone else. That's what I personally believe. It was probably something like that, right? So it's really, of course, become a subject of controversy, because when certain Muslims say that, okay, well, the Prophet's black, then you have Muslims who react, oh my God, how can you say such a thing? That's blasphemous. That's kufr. And there actually were scholars who said that.
Yeah, it's amazing. In your book, you actually quote from scholars who said that. Yeah.
Right. So the scholars who said that that's kufr to say that the Prophet ﷺ was black. Some of them say the reason why it's a problem is because it's disparagement of the prophets. It's disparaging to say that he's black. And that itself, that explanation is very, what's that? And of course, that explanation is problematic to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because there were other prophets who were black, right? So if it's disparaging to call someone black, then you shouldn't be able to call any prophet black.
Yeah, because it says in the Quran that God has sent messengers and prophets to all people groups, nations throughout history, which would include African countries as well. So there would have been black prophets by definition. There would have to have been.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah. So, and then on the other hand, Imam Nawawi, for instance, his argument is that, okay, well, it's kufr not because of it being disparagement. It's kufr because the Prophet ﷺ clearly was not black. In other words, because we know by tawatur, in other words, he's arguing that the Prophet ﷺ was of a different complexion, right? So it's describing him contrary to the way that we know him to be, right? So that is the reason that he gives, and that is, to me, is much more palatable to make that particular claim about it, But the reaction that you sometimes get from certain Muslims is that, okay, well, you can't say anything that suggests that the Prophet may have been black, But Jahiz, for instance, he goes as far as, for instance, there's a hadith where the Prophet says that I've been sent to every black and red person, to every red and every black person. And then Imam Nawawi goes to explain that, the scholars differ about how to interpret this. Some say, okay, the black was a reference to the Arabs because of the predominance of brownness among them. So it's talking about Arabs and Africans. Then some say the red is a reference to the Persians, and the blacks are a reference to the Africans. And some say it's the opposite. Some say it's the red are a reference to the blacks. To the Arabs, and the blacks are a reference to just simply all the blacks, etc. So in other words, Imam Jahiz, he takes this hadith and he goes on to comment on it, and he says that this particular hadith actually is really interesting in that that the Prophet ﷺ, he describes or classifies the Arabs under our category, because Jahiz was East African. He was Zanji, right? You would say he's from the Zanj. He's a Negro, right? So he's a Negro from East Africa. And he argues that, okay, well, in this hadith, the Prophet actually, he classifies the Arabs under our category. And I say our category because we know that the Arabs are not black, right? He said, but they are brown, right? They are light and dark brown. Yeah. But the Prophet included them under our category. So he said that gives us a certain type of honor and dignity that they'll be classified under that category. So someone who actually takes a similar argument as Jahid could argue that, okay, the Prophet was black in the sense of him being under that particular racial classification or category. But again, race taxonomy itself can be very problematic for that particular purpose. You know, how many races exist? Again, is it 63? Is it 13? Is it 5? Is it 3? Is it 2? Is it 1? Right? Right. And even in the Islamic literature, you do find disagreement about, okay, well, how many racial categories actually exist, right? So there's a lot that one can get, I think, from the book, of course. And even if we go on for 2 hours, 3 hours, you know, that's a lot, we won't be able to go through everything which is there.
I think, no, indeed, it'll be fascinating. I think people, and in your book, you survey many unfortunate examples of racism in the Islamic tradition, especially and perhaps surprisingly in the Maliki school. In chapter 2, especially, you go through. We don't have time to go through it now. I mean, clearly, people can read your book, second edition, based on your PhD dissertation, but very readable, actually. And a set of gems of information. Certainly, I didn't know about. A great education. So perhaps we will leave it there. That's right. Do you have any concluding thoughts by way of conclusion?
No, I just tell people that, I mean, the book is available on Amazon, Amazon.com. You can find the book there. You know, any questions, please do write in the comments, and if hopefully that can maybe we do a follow up for anything that may be confusing to anyone. But as stated, you know, there's a lot there that we didn't talk about, you know, but I wanted to.
There's so much we didn't cover.
Yeah. And so again, I just think that Muslims need to return to our own teachings when it comes to matters of race. Even the use of the word white supremacy, even though I love Dr. Jackson as well, I'm not. I think an argument can be made that the use of that term may be a little bit too alienating. You know, especially when we consider the fact that most Muslims are not utilizing it in the same way that Dr. Jackson utilizes it.
That's the problem with these words. They take on a life of their own, don't you?
Yeah.
One might claim to be the creator of the term or the originator, but it gets used by other people in different ways, and then the originator gets misunderstood because the words change its meaning. So it's that's how things work in reality. Yeah.
Right. It just seems like that it's not prophetic to employ terms of abuse, right? When we're trying to solve a problem, you don't call a person a bad name in order to make them do better, right? You actually, you know, you try to bring out the good, you know, what we call the angels, what do you call it, what the term we use, actually the greater angels in people. You try to pull it out of them, you know, because all people are redeemable. We're all from the same mother and father. That is what we're supposed to believe in. And I still believe that there's potential that Muslims, we can actually help the West solve a lot of problems, not just the race problem, you know, but a whole lot of problems.
No, this is true. Yeah, the kind of gender as well, and the issues of sexuality. And there is ultimately is a message of good news and healing, as is the Quran, for humanity. So it's much more than just an analysis. It's actually a solution, as many people are discovering. Alhamdulillah. So.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much indeed for your time, Dr. Abdullah Ali. Fascinating book, truly worthwhile having a look at this if you haven't come across it already. And I'll put those links to those articles that you mentioned, your articles and the book, in the description below, so people can dive deeply into this subject, which is well worth their time, I think. So thank you very much. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you.